Hey, what's up? What's up? This is Benji Bruce here with SpeakingLifestyle.com, and in this video, we're going to talk about how to memorize your presentation really fast. And lots of people, they obviously want to get better at public speaking, and they try to write out their presentation, but they just can't really remember exactly what they wanted to say. I mean, it's one thing to come up with a presentation, but how do you actually memorize that presentation? Now, as a speaker, you know that you shouldn't read off a script because it just doesn't look good. I mean, you know that it's going to make your presentation a million times better if you're just on stage and you just know your presentation cold. You don't have to look at anything, just bam, you get on there, you just know it. But how do you actually remember it? Some speakers, they just make maybe like PowerPoint slides and they don't really memorize their presentation. They just make the slides, they don't memorize it. They just kind of look back at what slide is on the screen and then they just talk about the slide that they see. And that's a sign that the speaker doesn't really know what they're doing. It's a sign that you're not dealing with a professional speaker. What most speakers don't realize that when you look back at your slides in order to see what you're going to talk about next, you're actually coming across as less confident. Because a confident person, they just know what to do. I mean, they're 100% in charge. They're sure of themselves. They just know what to do. But when you look back at the slide, you're basically saying, oh, I'm not sure what to talk about. Oh yeah, let's talk about that. That's pretty much what you're saying, and it's very subtle, but it can make all the difference in the world between a good presentation and a great one. And that's why you need to memorize your presentation. So here's how you do it. Here's how you memorize your presentation really fast. So memorizing your presentation, it actually starts with how you build your presentation. So let's say that you're making a PowerPoint presentation. So most speakers, they think about what content they want to deliver, and then they create a slide for each piece of content. Then they try to make the slide look all pretty with all these animations and some nice text, and they put it in the order that they think makes sense, and bam, they're all done. They think that because they're done making the PowerPoint, then that means they're done with the presentation. And some speakers might actually try to practice their presentation, so that's better than most. So they maybe try to memorize the slides and then they just talk and things like that. They might have a couple of ideas of what they're going to say, but there's no real script to it. They just kind of see the slide and then they just talk about the slide. Or let's say that instead of actually creating slides, you decide that you want to write a script. So let's say that you're writing it word for word and you're gonna say it on stage word for word. Once you've written it word for word, what exactly you're gonna say, well, now you try to memorize it and you realize that, hey, this is actually a lot harder to memorize than I thought. It's a full 60-minute presentation. How'd I memorize this whole thing? The way most speakers try to memorize their presentations is they create the presentation and then they try to memorize it. But the way you're going to really memorize it is to do it all at the same time, and then you're going to basically chunk information together. So let's say that you're making PowerPoint slides. Let's say that's how you're going to make your presentation. And let's say that your first slide, the title of it is How to Make Six Figures from Home. And let's say that your second slide, it has the 3 things that you're going to talk about. Now, what most speakers do is they create the slides. I mean, they make the text all fancy, then they move on to the next slide, they make the animations, all that stuff. What you need to do is you need to create the presentation in your head while you're creating the actual slides. So after you, let's say, design the slide that says how to make 6 figures from home, you think about what you're going to do and say at the live event, what you're going to do on stage. So maybe you envision yourself walking out on stage with a briefcase full of money, $100,000 to be exact, and you walk out not saying a single word, and you open up the briefcase and you allow all this money to fall out into the floor. It just all falls to the floor. Then the first slide pops up, and that's when you say, I'm going to show each and every one of you in here how to get money, how to make this money by the end of the presentation. So now what you do with your next slide, the next slide has the 3 things that you're going to talk about. So maybe you're going to talk about, let's say, I don't know, you're going to talk about how to use Facebook, Twitter, and Google AdWords to make this 6 figures. Well, now you have to make a decision. So do you want to maybe tell a story at this point, or do you want to do like a cool demonstration at this point? You have to make a decision. So let's say you're going to talk about a story of how you used Facebook to make $250,000 in a single day. So on the table, you picture this on the table. As you're making the slide, you make the slide with the Facebook, Twitter, Google AdWords, you're making the slide, and you're picturing this in your head. So you're picturing you're on stage, and then there's the table, and on the table you have your wallet, because your wallet has a check for $250,000. So just the sight of the wallet reminds you to tell your story about how you use Facebook to make all this money. What you're essentially doing is, while you're creating the slides, you're imagining the process of you speaking on stage. And what you're doing is you're essentially chunking all this information together when you're doing that. So let's say that you're going to talk about your Facebook story. Well, you don't really need to write it out word for word and then to look back at your slides to remind you of the story. What you need to do is practice the story all by itself. Don't try to practice your entire presentation. Practice the story all by itself, and then when you're on stage, your wallet is going to be on the table in front of you, and it's going to remind you, oh yeah, I need to tell this story about Facebook. And because you've chunked all the information about your story, you can just say it. I mean, you don't need to think about it, you just say it. So now you know that after your story, after your Facebook story, it's now time to give them a brief introduction about yourself, or whatever comes next in your presentation. So what you're doing is you're basically creating what are called markers in your presentation. And basically, it's like marker 1, the briefcase. Marker 2, Facebook story. Marker 3, my story. That's essentially what's happening. And because you know what you're going to do with the briefcase, because you know what you're going to do with the Facebook story, because you know what you're going to do with your story, it just naturally happens. You don't have to think about it word for word. You just naturally know what to say. So you're not going to struggle to remember because you've chunked everything together. It's like when you're telling a story, you don't struggle to remember every single word. You just know the story. You know where it's going, so you naturally know how to get there. When I get on stage just to do like a mind reading show, when there's no speaking involved, just a mind reading show, I'm up there for 60 minutes. And if you put 2 shows back to back, if you record 20 of my shows, then you'll notice that I pretty much say the same things throughout the entire presentation. I didn't sit down and I didn't try to memorize a script. I didn't try to write out the whole thing and try to memorize it. I just said like, okay, here are the 6 mind reading demonstrations that I'm going to do for the entire show. The first one I'm going to do is this, and I'm going to make sure that I kind of say this and this. After I'm done with that, now I'm going to move on to the second demonstration where I do this. And what I found was that it was a lot easier to remember what to say when you don't try to remember it, all as one thing, but you try to remember it just in chunks. So my show is divided up into different demonstrations that I'm doing. And once I know what I'm doing with the demonstration, maybe with the demonstration involving the box over there, I just immediately know what I'm going to say. And that also brings me to this. You have to know your stuff cold. The biggest reason people have a hard time when it comes to memorizing the presentation is because they're just not a master in the topic that they're talking about. So they might have done research and maybe read a few books, but they're not really a master on it. You see, when I'm on stage, I could easily go off script because I just know that no matter what I'm going to say, it's going to be the right thing. I just know that what I'm doing is where I'm going to end up. Your ability to master something will make it a lot easier to talk about it. So once you've mastered something, now you just know the content, but now it's just a matter of, can you actually deliver the content in an entertaining way and not be boring, or else nobody's going to listen. But it all starts with you being able to master the content first. And it's also important to know when you need to memorize your presentation and when you don't need to memorize your presentation. I mean, if it's just a one-time presentation, then you don't actually need to memorize everything. I mean, it's like the commencement speeches where you see Steve Jobs or Jim Carrey or other famous people giving these commencement speeches. They're almost always looking down at some piece of paper, their notes, to remember what they're talking about. But that's only because it's a one-time thing. If you're a motivational speaker, on the other hand, and you have to give the speech over and over, then you better memorize it and you better learn how to deliver it in an entertaining way. And that's just going to come over time where you're actually speaking on stage, doing it nonstop. But the key to memorizing your presentation is to just do it while you're making the presentation. So while you're making the slides or writing the script, think of what you're going to do on stage. Visualize it. Envision yourself actually doing it as you're writing it, as you're creating it. Picture yourself actually saying the words on stage as you're creating the PowerPoint slides, as you're creating the presentation. Then when you go over that presentation and you're practicing, you're going to realize that it's a lot easier to remember because you've already pictured it inside your mind. And that's how you memorize your presentations really, really fast. If you like this video and you want some other videos for your speaking business, then make sure you check out speakinglifestyle.com or subscribe to the YouTube channel, and I will see you soon. I'm outie.